Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. Welcome to tonight's webinar on the Bushfire Risk Assessment for the Hunter Transmission Project. My name is Alana Kosklin. I'm part of the community team for the project, and I'm joined tonight by Paul Demar. Paul, I might just throw to you if you want to introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah, g'day everyone. I'm glad you could all make it tonight. I'm Paul Demar. I'm from a consulting firm called GHD, and I'm their bushfire lead. My background is that I'm an operational firefighter, retired these days, but I used to be the fire chief in the old Forestry Commission. So I have a long background in bushfire fighting. And so I'm bringing that operational background to assessing what the risks are for the HTP project. Back to you, Alana.
Thanks. Thank you. Okay. So before we begin tonight, I'd just like to acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the first peoples and the traditional custodians of Australia, as well as being the oldest continuing culture in human history. And I'm joining tonight from beautiful Awabakal land, as evidenced by the many photos of Newcastle I have in the background. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Wonnarua, Awabakal and the Darkinjung people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we are delivering the Hunter Transmission Project. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all Aboriginal people of these communities. So just a bit of housekeeping for tonight's session. The webinar is being recorded and the recording will be placed on our website for the project in about the next week or so. We will have a Q&A session at the end after we've presented the information. There is a Q&A function, so I'd encourage you to pop your questions in there as you think of them. I would ask maybe if we could focus the questions on the bushfire risk assessment, which is Paul's area of expertise and what we're here to talk about. And so the way the webinar will run is I'll do a very brief overview of the project, what it involves and where it is. And then I'll hand over to Paul, who's going to run us through some general information about transmission lines and bushfire risk, and then some information on the bushfire risk assessment for the HTP. So HTP at a glance. The Hunter Transmission Project, it's one of the state's most critical energy projects, and it will help to provide energy security from renewable sources like solar and wind as the state's coal-fired power stations are closed. It involves a new overhead 500 kilovolt transmission line that's about 100 kilometres long, as well as new supporting infrastructure, which includes 2 switching stations. And essentially it'll connect Bayswater up near Singleton to Araring down in Lake Macquarie, helping to strengthen the state's core electricity grid. And essentially it'll do this by unlocking the electricity supply that will be generated in the Central West Arana Renewable Energy Zone, which is out near Dubbo, and the New England Renewable Energy Zone, which is out near Armidale. So this is a bit of a map of the project corridor. Like I said, it's about 100 kilometres long. And when we talk about it, we've kind of broken it up into a north, central and a south section just to make it easier. So that north section runs Bayswater to Broke. It is mostly on power station, mining, industrial and Department of Defence land. HTP Central includes the Colburn and Corrobear state forests. And then HTP South runs from the Olney State Forest to Araring. And we are proposing a switching station in the old estate forest to be built on the site of an old commercial timber plantation. And so from there, the project would then connect in with the existing 500 kilovolt line that runs to Araring. I guess just a quick explainer on the map. It's got different colours for the corridor. So that light blue section, which you can see particularly up in the north, is the preliminary corridor that we went out to the community with in late 2023. And then that was subsequently revised, which is a pinky colour, which is a little bit difficult to see. That was in May last year. And then in December last year, we've gone out with that final corridor, which is the orange colour. And so that process of revision and the different iterations of that corridor has been able to occur using community feedback, consultation with government agencies and other organisations, and technical studies to really refine that corridor down. So that was a very quick run through on the HTP. And I will hand over to you, Paul, to run us through the rest.
Okay, thanks, Alana. So look, I'll go through a few slides here, but I'll leave most of it to the end for questions. I thank you for your interest in advance, and look forward to any questions that you might have at the end. But I'll work through some slides here that really just cover the bare bones of the HTP in terms of bushfire risk and the assessment that's been undertaken. So firstly, without looking specifically at HTP, in terms of transmission lines, the question is often asked as to, what is the risk associated with transmission lines? So what we're talking about here at HTP is the 500 kilovolt transmission line class. That's the largest class of transmission lines in Australia. We've had those the 500 kV transmission networks running since the early 80s, since about 1982. So the line that Alana was referring to recently, that this one will connect with, which is the Araring to Kemps Creek line that took power generated Araring down to Sydney. That line's been operating since 1982 continuously. It's a dual circuit 500 kV line, very similar to what the HTP line is that will be built. So that's effectively been operating for over 368,000 hours continuously. And that line, and the only other 500 kV line that's in New South Wales, has never started a fire. And Victoria is the only other state with 500 kV lines, and so it's the case that no 500 kV line has ever started a fire in Australia. So that's the largest, most robust class of transmission lines. So often we hear about electricity infrastructure starting fires, and it certainly can. Mostly, historically, you might have heard of some of the Black Saturday fires. There were 5 or 6 of those down in Victoria, which were started by electricity lines. There are some more recently in New South Wales, up in the Blue Mountains in 2013, and another fire more recently than that down near Tathra that started a fire that burnt some houses. All those fire events, and I've looked at the major inquiries going all the way back to 1977. All of those fires are started by distribution lines, so their voltages up to and including around 33 kilovolts. So in a very different class, they're typically the lines that you see on wooden poles that go from the substations to supply power to streets in suburban areas and in rural areas. So just for the avoidance of confusion, the history of fires starting from electricity assets in Australia is overwhelmingly from those distribution lines, and there's never been a fire from a 500 kV transmission line, and it's even extremely rare for lesser voltages than 500 kV, such as 330 kV lines to start fires. So that's just a bit of historical context for you about whether transmission lines increase the bushfire risk. We might go to the next slide now, Alana. Okay, so why is that? Why is it that these 500 kV lines present a very low bushfire risk? Well, firstly, they're suspended on very large steel lattice tower. You would have seen those, particularly if you're around the Hunter. Many of those are 330 kV lines, but there are some 500 kV lines. They're in the order of 60 to 80 metres high, and they suspend the conductors. These are dual circuit 500 kV lines with HTP. So there are 3 lines suspended vertically above each other on each side of the tower, and so they're suspended more than 13 metres above the vegetation. That's the lowest point, so usually much higher than that. And those towers and those lines are not combustible. They're made of metal, and these 500 kV transmission lines and towers, they don't burn down. They're in fact the towers that are the 500 kV towers and the lines themselves are built to withstand most bushfire conditions, and they're designed to prevent the ignition of bushfires. So they're constructed to Australian standards. Australian standard AS 7000 is the design spec for transmission lines. There's design specs for the switching stations as well. And because the 500 kV network is essentially the backbone, it's the bulk electricity supply component of electricity networks. If they go out, whole cities and whole collections of towns go out. So they are managed to the highest standards of maintenance and inspection, because we simply can't have whole cities being blacked out because a transmission line's had a fault. We experience blackouts reasonably regularly, but that's usually from faults or things like trees falling on distribution lines. They're much more localized power outages. So certainly in the recent Cyclone Alfred situation up north, that's the outages there are largely caused by failures in the or faults in the distribution network system. It's very rare for transmission lines to have these faults that cause outages, and that's because of their inherently high reliability design. The 500 kV network is operated remotely, and because of their robust fire resilient design, they never require firefighters to go and defend them. It's just not the case. We've got the Araring to Kemps Creek line that's been there for 42 years. That line route's been impacted by multiple fires. You don't send firefighters out to go and defend a 60 to 80 metre high steel lattice tower design. So they have inherent, designed-in passive protection against bushfires. And it's even reasonably rare for those lines to experience any kind of outage as a result of a bushfire. So we had a pretty big test in New South Wales in the recent 2019-20 so-called Black Summer bushfires, terrible bushfires. impacts that we haven't seen in New South Wales before. Those fires gave the transmission network a real test out, and the 500 kV network section of the electricity grid, there were 6 what are called transient outages on that over the entire black summer. And by a transient outage, I mean a bushfire's passed underneath. It's caused that to trip temporarily. The way the system works, it re-energizes after a delay, and when they re-energized, the power was restored. So we didn't have extensive damage or failures of the 500 kV network, despite that network being impacted by those terrible fires in 2019-20. And the final point on why 500 kVs present such a low bushfire risk is that they are managed to the absolute highest standards. So the highest frequency of cyclic inspections, there are ground inspections, there are helicopter inspections, there are inspections using drones, using corona cameras. Basically, there's an extensive suite of inspection processes that are applied to try and identify any defects before they turn into faults, and that includes the vegetation. So unlike the distribution network that has got a history of starting fires, 500 kV transmission networks are in cleared easements. These easements are 70 metres wide, and there's a regular cyclic program of vegetation inspection and treatment, including inspection for hazard trees even beyond the 70 metre wide easement, to ensure that we don't get any conflicts going on between vegetation and the 500 kV lines. So just by their design and the very high reliability that is required of those systems and the associated maintenance and inspection routines that serve that purpose, 500 kV lines, that's why they present such a low risk. Okay, we might go to the next slide, please, Alana. Okay, one of the questions that that often comes up is about transmission lines and what impact they might have on aerial firefighting. Transmission lines rarely obstruct aerial firefighting efforts, including in the native forest areas along the HTP alignment. The emergency services, such as the Rural Fire Service and New South Wales Fire and Rescue, and also the other main fire authorities like National Parks and Wildlife Service and Forestry Corporation, they follow established procedures and protocols for working safely near transmission lines. Generally, they won't go closer than about 25 metres from transmission lines, but they can work quite effectively around transmission lines and have had a very long history of doing so. I recall back to when I was fire chief at Forestry, and we had 330 kV lines running through our plantations down around Tumut and Tumbarumba and out on the central tablelands, and we were routinely able to conduct our activities containing fires and preventing the pine plantations and other areas, local communities, from burning down, despite the presence of those networks through those areas. Aerial water bombing can be conducted around transmission lines and in coordination with ground crews. If you think about it, these 500 kV transmission lines are out there in the weather. We get really intense downpours with thunderstorms. We don't get the transmission lines going out because they're getting a bit of water on them from really intense rainfall. No firefighter, it's not within it's specifically against the procedures and protocols to squirt water from a fire hose towards a 500 kV power line. You'd have to have a bit of a death wish to do that sort of thing. But even so, with heavy, thunderstorm downpours that have occurred historically over the last 42 odd years for the Eraring to Kemps Creek line, those don't cause these power lines to arc to ground or to have outages. So water bombing is conducted around the lines. It's usually avoided to drop it straight through the line, but even so, there's very little conflict between aerial firefighting and transmission lines. Now, those transmission lines are on aviation maps, and they're clearly visible to pilots. Less so is things like those smaller distribution lines that I was mentioning before. It's not uncommon for helicopters that are low flying to have altercations with those distribution lines, but the large transmission lines, that's not the case. And in fact, helicopters are one of the tools that are used to inspect those transmission lines on an annual basis, and they frequently work close to transmission lines. Okay, the HTB corridor itself it's been designed with a community consultation process to try and minimise the impact on aerial firefighting operations and to avoid things like water sources that helicopters or water scooping aircraft might use. So along the HTP line route, it's been a deliberate process to try and avoid, to the extent possible, any water sources that might be used for aerial firefighting. Now, while this slide's dealing with aerial firefighting, I might deal with ground firefighting as well. In the design of the line, there's been consultation with the fire services, and it's been sought to avoid, to the extent possible, some of the really strategic trails that are in the joint agency fire plans to make sure that they're not adversely impacted for use by firefighters in containing fires that might occur in the landscapes near and around the HTP corridor. Okay, we might flick forward to the next slide, please, Lana. Okay, so those were some generic things that I've just discussed with you. We might move into the actual risk assessment for site specific to the HTP. So the purpose of the risk assessment is to assess the bushfire risks both during the construction phase and the operation phase. So when the report comes out, it will assess those two phases separately because they have quite different risk profiles, and to identify the appropriate bushfire mitigation measures to manage the bushfire risk, any residual risk that might be there. The assessment looks at the likelihood of the transmission lines starting a fire, and that's not just during the operation phase, which I was discussing earlier, but also during the construction phase. The assessment looks at the impact on bushfire-related public safety risk in particular, and it looks at bushfire threats to the HTP and the workforce that will be out there that would be out there constructing that network if it's approved, particularly during that construction phase. Okay, next slide, please, Lana. Okay, some of the findings. We already discussed before that the lines have a very low likelihood of starting fire. That's during the operation phase when they're operating, but there's a construction phase that would need to be gone through first. And there's a number of activities that, if not managed properly, would have the potential to cause fire ignitions. So things like hot works, sparks from metal grinding or cutting or welding. They're a known cause of fire historically. Earthworks during vegetation clearance. So if you've got steel track machinery working around rocky country, you can get sparks produced if the rock is hard enough. Sandstone's not generally hard enough to do that, but some rock types are hard enough to do that. And those sparks can, under some conditions, cause ignition. Vehicles, you've got engine manifolds on vehicles that if they come into contact with long grass, have been known mostly in farming situations or camping situations to start fires. And obviously smoking, if there's inadequate discipline applied and smokers discard cigarette butts, those can also start fires. So the construction phase of HTP has the potential to start fires, but all of those are risks that can be effectively managed and have been in the past. There's the solutions for mitigating those risks are tried, tested and proven in many previous projects, and if they're diligently applied, you can eliminate ignition potential from those particular causes. So to that end, one of the requirements, should HTP be approved, would be the development of a detailed bushfire prevention plan, which will address all of those construction activities, as well as any others that would be applied across all parts of the HTP throughout the construction phase. During operation, so moving out of the construction phase and into the operation phase, the likelihood of HTP starting a bushfire that could spread and cause significant consequences is very low, as we've already discussed. We might move to the next slide, please, Alana. Okay, so in terms of public safety risk, which was one of the major items listed specifically for the bushfire risk assessment to cover, once developed, that bushfire prevention plan will play a key role in reducing bushfire-related risks during the construction phase. The HTP is not expected to significantly impact existing bushfire safety levels. The factors that affect bushfire risk in things like towns that might be along the HTP route, out in the Conjoy Valley, further up in the Hunter. The factors that affect bushfire risks for communities are the extents of vegetation, bushfire-prone vegetation, the weather that would affect a fire, and the terrain in which a fire might burn. And the HTP is not going to materially affect any of those things. It's not going to change the weather. It's not going to alter at the landscape scale the vegetation cover in the landscape that would carry a fire towards any particular town you might choose to consider, and it's not going to change the topography. There will be some clearing in those easements, but at the landscape scale, where you have bushfires threatening towns, it's not materially going to affect any of those factors that affect the consequence of a bushfire. And as we've discussed earlier, the likelihood of them starting a fire is extremely low, and so there's no real material effect on public bushfire safety by putting the HTP line where it's proposed to go. As part of the project, there will be upgrades to existing access roads, particularly into the state forests through which they run, so Olney, Corribbear and Pecolbin, which will actually improve access and egress from those forest areas, and they'll also improve access for fire management and control for things like prescribed burning, but also for fire response. So many of the major strategic roads that go through Watagan State Forest, Olney State Forest, Corribbear and Pacolman State Forests will have significant improvements made to them, which will make them improve the access for Forestry Corporation and for Rural Fire Service and any other fire agencies that might be assisting. And they'll also, at the same time, improve emergency exit for people who might be undertaking recreation in those forests. All right, we'll go to the next slide, please. All right, in terms of bushfire threats, so during construction, we'll have a pretty significant workforce out there. A pretty significant workforce would be out there constructing and stringing these lines, and they'll be working in those bushfire-prone forests. So a second key thing that's going to need to be developed for the project is a bushfire safety system for that workforce to address that risk. So what that means is that roads identified for evacuation, should there be any fire threats that arise, there'll be preventative measures. You know, if catastrophic or extreme bushfire danger days are forecast by the Met Bureau, you know, what will be the procedure to manage the risk to the HTP workforce. All of those things will be worked through and documented in a bushfire safety system applying to the whole of the HTP project, including not only to where the towers and the lines would go, but also to construction support areas, some of which might have worker accommodation and temporary site offices in them. Now, those forests through which the HTP would run are existing working forests, timber production working forests, and Forestry Corporation have had a long history of having harvesting crews out working in those forests, and they have a safe working system that allows that to occur safely. There's no history of timber workers or the transport contractors that have supported moving logs from harvesting sites to local mills being burnt out by bushfires. So a system that's similar to that historically successful system that Forestry Corp have operated over decades for running harvesting operations in those forests would also be put in place to ensure the HTP workforce can remain safe whilst it's undertaking construction in those same areas. Okay, next one, please. All right, I think I've covered off on most of the key elements of the bushfire assessment. The only other thing that I probably glossed over at the end there is that one of the compliance requirements for the HTP will be to comply with a regulatory instrument called Planning for Bushfire Protection, which is produced by the Rural Fire Service. And in that regard, there will be asset protection zones around the switching stations, even though those are unmanned switching stations and the buildings in there are not of a combustible nature. There will still be asset protection zones around those areas for their protection, and there will be asset protection zones around each of the construction support areas, including any that have workers' accommodation in there. And for each of those sites, there will be what's called an emergency management and evacuation plan prepared to Rural Fire Service standards, which detail in a pre-planned way how different levels of fire danger are prepared for and what the preemptive response will be in terms of managing evacuations from those sorts of facilities. So in short, the requirements of planning for bushfire protection will be met or would be met for all aspects of the development should it proceed. Okay, I might pause there. That's been a lot of me doing some talking. We might open it up there for some questions, Alana.
Great, thanks, Paul. So we did give people the chance to ask questions when they registered, and we do have a couple here, which we may have already covered, but I'll see if you've got any other thoughts. So what are the risks to the operation of the transmission line from bushfire impacts?
Okay, so obviously one of the main risks to the operation of the transmission line is fire itself. So if you've got transmission lines running through bushfire prone areas, noting that, you know, we've had the Araring to Kemps Creek line running down through that very similar country to what HTP would run through that heavily dissected sandstone forests between the Hawkesbury River and Araring. If you get fires burning through there, particularly on a nasty day, those fires, if the flames lick up towards the lines, or if the convection columns with ionised air within the convection column work their way up towards the lines, they can cause outages. Those are typically transient outages, as I mentioned before, and in a, you know, if you had a very serious case, it's possible that you could have some kind of damage to the line. But that's not been the historical experience with these lines, the existing lines in New South Wales. They've largely avoided any serious impact, and so the risks are largely to temporary and short-term transient. It's operation of the protection system, which, when there's a fault current detected, trips out the line and then automatically re-energizes it after a short period. That period can vary, but it's in the order of seconds to restore power. So that's probably the main risk to the operation of the transmission line from bushfires. There's you know, absolutely minimal risk really to, because of the just the inherent robust fire resilient nature of the assets themselves. They don't need defending by firefighters. There's relatively little risk to the lines themselves.
Great. Thanks, Paul. And how will the transmission line and associated roads affect bushfire suppression activities?
Okay, so particularly within the forests through which the HTP runs, so through Olney and Corribbear and Pecolbin, there are existing road networks through those forests, and some of those are of a more strategic nature than others. The longer through roads, that particularly those that go north-south, firefighters historically have undertaken such activities as backburning or burning out from those roads to contain fires to the west, to stop them coming out of those forests into more populated areas down in the valleys. Quite a lot of consultations going on between Energy Co and Forestry Corp and RFS in trying to minimise the effect on any of those roads. Many of those strategic roads will be enhanced, they'll be improved, so that there'll actually be some improvements to their construction. But the line route largely is offset from those key roads that affect suppression activities by design, deliberately, to try and avoid any impact on the use of those roads for suppression activities. There will be, obviously, with all the towers that go in and the need to access those for maintenance, there'll be some additional roads that go in, which will be useful for fire service in getting to attack lightning strikes, lightning strike fires that might occur in those forest areas. But there's no real negative impact of the selected transmission line route on the key roads that the fire services consider strategic and important to them in conducting their suppression activities.
Great, thanks, Paul. I've just stopped sharing my screen so I can see the Q&A function. It looks like we've got a couple of questions. So let's start with the first one. Will the bushfire risk assessment look at the potential for increased risk posed by having a highly disturbed site with the access roads, etc., that may result in greater public access as opposed to a greenfield site that exists in the state forests?
So there will be some extensions to the road network, mainly so that access for construction of the towers can be undertaken, but also for subsequent maintenance of those. As to which of those would be publicly accessible and which won't be, that's something that will be addressed should the project be approved. Then there'll be extensive consultation with the Rural Fire Service. We've undertaken some consultation with the Rural Fire Service, and that issue was in fact raised. We ran a forum up at the Maitland Fire Control Centre and discussed that with quite a diverse group from local captains right through to the uniformed professional full-time fire control officers and district managers on that issue, and that is something that would be worked through should the project be approved. There'll be a consultative process to identify which, if any, new tracks might be kept closed to the public in the manner you see in some national parks, for example, where they put a barrier up across the trail to restrict access into those trails.
Great, thanks, Paul. And we've got one here. The impact of the transmission lines on helicopter aerial firefighting has been mentioned. What about LAT and VLAT operations?
Sure, okay. So the large air tankers and the very large air tankers, those are large water bombing resources. They need to land to load up with retardant, so they're typically operated from a fairly small selection of bases. For example, at RAF Richmond and out at Dubbo, for example. Those sorts of aircraft are not really what you would call initial attack aircraft. They're not for, by the time you have a fire reported and you get to organise what you've got to go through a state request process to get that particular class of aircraft. By the time they get those mobilised and to sort of locations along the HTP in adverse weather, we're not really talking about initial attack scenarios. That's more your smaller helicopters and medium helicopters that are more in that initial attack capability. But those large air tankers and very large air tankers are typically used in community protection. So where a fire might be making its way towards a town or a community, they're very useful in putting down longer, much greater loads than what a helicopter can do. But there's no history of using that sort of aircraft in the forests through which these lines run. There's certainly no need to drop retardant to protect these particular lines. As I mentioned before, they're inherently fire resilient and robust. So I think it's pretty unlikely that there would be LATs or VLATs operating in the forest areas through which the lines are going, but it is possible. But really, the presence of those lines is not going to materially affect the operation of those aircraft.
Thanks, Paul. I've got another one here. How wide, in general terms, are asset protection zones in the compound area required to be?
Okay, so there's two different switching stations. There's one in Olney State Forest. That's going to have the largest of the two asset protection zones. It's the asset protection zone design is informed by the slope and the vegetation type and an assumed fire danger index of 100. So the slope is a little bit steeper on the western side of that Olney substation site or switching station site. So it's 75 metres wide on that western side, and it's 55 metres wide north, south and east. And that degree of that width of asset protection zone is sufficient to achieve what's called a BAL level of 29 within the switching station. And given that the switching station itself they're not habitable structures, they're not dwellings, they're class 10 buildings, that degree of protection is commensurate with the type of facilities that are being developed there. The other switching station is up at Bayswater. In fact, it's right next to an existing switching station that's there. I can't remember right off the top of my head what the widths of the asset protection zone there, but it's in the order of 25 to 35 metres because that's a more grassy environment that switching station is in. But that smaller APZ, because of the flatter terrain and the less hazardous vegetation type, will still achieve a BAL 29 outcome.
I've got another question. What could the bushfire management plan contain?
Okay, well, there will be a bushfire prevention plan, and that will go into detail in identifying all and any potential sources of ignition, particularly during the construction phase, and will identify what procedures will be applied to prevent ignitions from occurring, and in particular those measures to prevent ignition will increase in their intensity as different levels of fire danger are forecast. So, for example, if there was a catastrophic day forecast, you wouldn't have any potentially fire-causing activities happening at all. If it was an extreme level of fire danger, that might also hold true for those, or there might be activities that are restricted to some part of the morning before the fire danger gets up to the levels where it becomes problematic. And there will be, there will be in that bushfire prevention plan would also identify all the prescriptions, if you like, to be implemented by the contractor workforce in undertaking those activities. So if it's hot works, for example, it's things like clearing a vegetation-free area around where they're doing the hot works. It might be having certain extinguishers there right on site, present, ready to use should a spark get anywhere near some vegetation residues that it might set fire to. It might include, this is all to be designed, of course, it might include having on site a fire appliance to as a backup for the fire extinguishers that would be there. There would be specifications for training required for the crews to use those fire extinguishers that might be on site. So all of those, these are tried, tested and proven risk controls that have been applied not only in transmission projects but many other outdoor construction projects that have served to eliminate, prevent fires being caused by those particular potential ignition sources. So that's a fire prevention plan. The other plan that I mentioned is a bushfire emergency management and evacuation plan. So they will be in place for the construction support sites where there would be project site offices and worker accommodation camps that preemptively plan what are the triggers for evacuating those particular sites, or not even manning them for the day if there was a catastrophic fire danger level forecast for the following day. The Rural Fire Service have a set of guidelines to which those plans need to conform to, and so the plans that would be produced would be in accordance with those Rural Fire Service guidelines. So they would form part of the plan, and there would be a similar plan I mentioned before, the workforce safety system, which would plan those preparedness and those preemptive evacuation measures that might be implemented should there be a lightning ignition or a campfire ignition or something upwind of where these construction areas are, just to ensure that not only public safety, that's obviously a key focus, but the safety of the workforce that's out there or would be out there constructing the assets.
Definitely. I've got a question here I can answer. Thanks, Tony. Will a recording of this session be available? Yes, it will. We will place the recording on our website within the next week. Okay. How will coordination with local fire services and emergency agencies be handled through construction and operation?
Okay, so those are key matters. Good questions, by the way. Those are key matters that would be included in the fire plan. So there will be protocols that are documented in that fire plan and briefed to the workforce that are conducting those construction activities for things like what's the fire danger forecast for the day. If there was any fire reports either way from the Rural Fire Service reporting to HTP constructors that there's a fire that could potentially threaten them at some stage in the future, or whether it's from the workforce reporting that they've observed a fire to both the land managers, so Forestry Corporation, if it's on the Forestry Corp land. There are other land tenures, obviously, the mines, and there's Department of Defence, and there's some private land where the fire protection is provided by the Rural Fire Service. But those protocols would, for coordination, would all be one of the key subjects of that bushfire planning.
Great. I think we've probably got time for one more, which is, when will the bushfire management plan be available to the public?
Okay, the bushfire risk assessment that I'm currently working on will come out with the EIS, which I understand is scheduled. I'm not the authority on that, but I think it's June or something like that.
Yeah,
is that right?
Mid-2025, that's right.
Yep. But you know, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. We haven't got an approved project here yet. If the project is approved, then one of the conditions would be that these various plans are prepared, and they would be prepared subsequent to that. And I can't give you an exact time frame on those, but they would be obviously timed such that they're in place before the construction work starts.
Right. I think that might be it for the questions. I might just give it 30 more seconds in case someone's madly typing away, which was our experience last time we ran one of these webinars.
They've been very good questions.
They have been. It's been a really good, engaged conversation. It's been great. I think that might be all we are going to get tonight. So I just want to mention, probably before we wrap up, we will be running a series of webinars like this on different topics that are being assessed as part of the project's environmental impact statement. So we will advertise those on our website when they're booked. And we are also running drop-in information sessions next Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so the 24th to the 26th. If you want to come and speak to the project team, some of the technical staff will be there, have a more in-depth conversation. We'd love to see you there. So thanks very much, Paul, for your time. That's been really great. I really appreciate you joining us tonight.
And thanks everyone for your interest. It's I know everyone's very busy, and so for you to spare an hour of your time to listen to me droll on about bushfire risk, thank you very much. I hope I've answered your questions. Yep. Thank you.
Thanks. Enjoy your evening, everyone. Bye.